Joe must be busy. Hey, Dudley. All right, let's get started. All right, we're going to talk about. Put this in the chat. Emanuma Baraka. If you put that name in the comments, if you don't mind, so people can know what it is. I can do it, I guess. I don't know where Joe's at. Hold on a second. I'll be right back. I'm gonna check something. Thank you.
I was trying to unmute you.
You're muted. All right, everybody, let's get started. You guys already stopped the music. Let's find out. I did. Good. All right. So let's read what he has to say. Of course, black ain't a color. It's the context. But the racialized name of a quote country, a people, a nationality under racialized capitalism, the colonialist oppression, especially in the U.S., color marks the boundaries of subjugated national territories, and color becomes the unique element in the class relationship to the colonizing nation. That is, in the era of imperialism, class struggle manifests itself as struggling between oppression, proletarian, and oppressor, bourgeoisie, nation/peoples, the colonized proletarian, and the colonized bourgeoisie, nation/peoples classes are the opposing poles in proletarian socialist world revolution against the world capitalist/bourgeoisie. At the moment, it is as if we hold an unarticulated concept of class and doesn't transcend race, but incorporates it as one of its peculiar distinguishing characteristics. Sometimes we say race when we actually mean to say or should say class or nation. Something like that distinction, which underlies the way Fanon opposes racial feelings to racial prejudice. All right, we're going to go down and read what Fanon says. Racial feelings as opposed to racial prejudice, and that determination to fight for one's life, which characterizes the natives' reply to oppression, are obviously good enough reasons to join in the fight. But you do not carry on a war, nor suffer brutal or widespread repression, nor look on while all other members of your family are wiped out in order to make racialism or hatred triumph. Racialism and hatred and resentment, a legitimate desire for revenge, cannot sustain a war of liberation. At all events, as we have noticed, the enemy tries to win support of certain sectors of the population, of certain districts, and of certain chiefs. As the struggle is carried on, instructions are issued to the settlers and to the police forces. Their behavior takes on a different complexion. It becomes more human. They even go so far as to call the native Mister when they have dealings with him. Attentions and acts of courtesy come to the rule. The native is, in fact, made to feel that things are changing. Back up to the comments. At the moment, it is as if we hold an unarticulated concept of class and that doesn't transcend race, but incorporates it as one of its peculiar distinguishing characteristics. Sometimes we say race when we actually mean to say or should say class or nation. Something like that distinction which underlies the way that I already read it, or the way Fanon opposes racial feelings to racial prejudice, or something like that which underlies Weinreich's statement as she draws from Fanon's black skin's white mask, that Quote, the white man makes the black man be reorganizing only his skin. What really happened is that the white man was made in the same process and by the same means, so that even today we tend to recognize ourselves and others by skin color, race, and it's all of fiction, social construct, and a particular form of our element or of consciousness. We find ourselves resting on this foundation even when we use the word race to mean the group or the people, as in he's a race man. Because race has come to function on the superstructure, it becomes part of our distinct way of life and cultural existence. Racial interests have become part of the group interests that we share, and which stand as antagonistic to the interests of others, groups of people, classes and nations. Race as a characteristic of the peculiar class and national social relations of capitalists and colonialist exploitation has helped to provide us with an understanding of being a distinct community which extends across local and regional boundaries, constituting part of our national bond. It's part of the collective consciousness we have of ourselves, which informs the creation of the organization and institutions that we use in pursuit of our aims. Now, all of this is really less about race than about class, the national formation and consciousness. Rather not about race, since that's a fiction. Because race is a fiction, what we have to do is resolve the theoretical problem posed by our being and uniquely constituted oppressed peoples, which depend upon the context of an analysis, can be understood as, quote, 1, an oppressed nation, and or 2, a potentially revolutionary proletarian class. Now I know there'll be all kinds of objections from all quarters, and among them the claim that I can't have it both ways. All I can say is that this isn't my way. It's the way that it is. What it becomes is up to you, i.e., what you do or fail to do to transform yourself and the present reality. For example, rather new African people struggle to create a separate socialist existence on distinct territories depends upon a new African people do or fail to do. Rather new Africans join with others to make the socialist revolution in for the whole of the U.S. depends upon the new Africans and others doing or failing to do. Let me hasten to point out by, quote, new Africans, I don't mean black people. I mean those who come to identify their nationality as new Africans, and who thus exhibit the consciousness and embrace the values and philosophy. Those who pursue the goals of new Africans. To me, being a new African is not about the color of one's skin, but about one's thoughts and practice. I know that not everyone agrees with this, but that's their problem. As I mentioned earlier, Fanon doesn't mention racism until third chapter of Wretched, where he makes the connection with his critique of colonized bourgeois forces, but also notice the references to the racialized thought of the intellectuals in chapter 4. He shows how they uphold the concept of race and promote racialized thought and practice in order to block the advance of national and social relations, to prevent the radical unity of the people from averting the rise of the neo-colonial state. Underlining all references of racism to race are the economic and political relationships between on the one hand, the colonized bourgeois forces and the forces of colonialism, and on the other hand, the colonized bourgeois forces and the masses of the people. Put another way, quote, at the foundation of racism is a system of savagely unequal economic and political relations. It matters not, rather we're talking about the form of colonial relations between Algeria and France, or between New Africans and the US. Weinrich devotes an entire section of her chapter to Wretched to set up what I consider to be a false polemic between Marx and Fanon. She succeeds in announcing her bias towards her and her ignorance of socialist thought. She also reveals herself as one of those wily intellectuals that Fanon warns us against. That is, Weinrich engages in an exercise to cloud the revolutionary socialist methodology underlying Fanon's analysis, and in order to do so, she takes a few of his statements out of context. She provides us with an example of some of the meanings used by New African bourgeoisie forces who seek power in the name of a narrow nationalism in representing a race. Those who seek to truly oppose and uproot racial thought and racism have to do so by basing their efforts on the struggle to depose the belief in race, decompose the belief in race, and unveil the capitalist motive underlining the practice of racism. Racism will continue to exist so long as the belief of the concept of race and the material reality underlining its existence it exists. It's this belief which allows racism to appear as totally autonomous of the economic relations that it serves. Unless and until it's uprooted, its form will change, and the pervasiveness and intensity of its practice will ebb and flow, following the need of its base, the political requirements of an oppressive state, and the forms and levels of struggle engaged by the people. Must racism be challenged? Yes. Does race have a certain kind of reality? Yes. But what if we fail to focus on is that race is only as real as our consciousness and our practice allow it to be? Those who try to make us believe otherwise are either deluded or have the conscious motive of not wanting us to shift our attention from the shadows of the robber, for fear that our attention will be focused on them. Their motives are to join in the robbery. They want to pursue the capitalist way, and they only oppose the efforts of the rulers of capital to exclude them from the spoils and the position. And they do it in the name of opposing racism. But you never hear them shout seriously against capitalism. You surely never hear them proclaim a belief in socialism, nor do they urge the people to study socialism and to join them in its pursuit. Weinrich sets up her false polemic by saying that colonized people need a coherent political philosophy, and that, I think this might be her, Fanon advocates socialism as both a practical and ethical solution of emerging countries. My nationalist party in Africa, however, couched socialist goals in what Fanon considered to be misleading, even dangerous, Marxist language. It's not that Fanon necessarily disagrees with Marx's critique of industrial capitalism, analysis of European society, the dialectical theory of history. Instead, he recognizes that economics and social organizations in underdeveloped countries bear little resemblance to conditions in highly developed ones, and that the pressures of the colonial situation must be dealt with as well. Let us even touch that sarcastic use of solution. But we have to deal with the implied contrast between socialist goals and Marxist language, where I'd like to know, does Fanon discuss this alleged misleading, dangerous Marxist language? What is Fanon supposed to have said about the use of such language to couch socialist goals? Finally, she seems unable to make the distinction between the methods and the particular results derived from the application of that method of concrete situations in terms of both place and time. Nah, it's Weinrich who tries to mislead her. mislead here, starting by accenting solutions, as if to say that Fanon advocated something less than scientific socialism in one of his clearest statements on the issue. Of course, we know that the capitalist regime is so far as it as a way of life cannot leave us free to perform our work at home, nor our duty in the world. Capitalist exploitation and cartels and monopolies are the enemies of underdeveloped countries. On the other hand, the choice of the socialist regime, a regime which is completely oriented towards the people as a whole and based on the principles that people are the most precious of all possessions, will allow us to go forward more quickly and more harmoniously, and thus make impossible that caricature of society where all economic and political power is held in the hands of a few who regard the nation as a whole with scorn and contempt. That was Fanon. What is it that Weinreich believes us to what is what Weinreich wants us to believe? That Fanon advocates a form of socialism that couldn't be described in some of the language used by Marx? An African socialism, maybe? That's Fanon didn't think that the methodology used by Marx to analyze and critique industrial capitalism, Western European society, is applicable to colonial African society. Maybe this is why she thought it apt to cap off the section with Fanon's often quoted suggestions that Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time we have to do with the colonial problem. That's what Walter Rodney, Frantz, that's what they did. They stretched the analysis of Marxism onto the colonial situation. Marx at one point towards the end of his life was going out to Africa to figure out the colonial situation too. Walter Rodney, Amilcar Cabral showed that we got to switch the methodology, the tool of Marxism in the colonial assets. Okay, here we go. Okay, cool. Walter Rodney. I say that the language Fanon would have considered dangerous and misleading is that used by those who couch bourgeoisie goals under the banner of, say, African socialism. Walter Rodney told us that some of those waving this banner were under the illusion that they could find a third way between capitalism and doctrinaire Marxism, while others were blatantly dishonest from the beginning, cheap tricksters, attempting to hoodwink the people because the people were, quote, no longer willing to accept anything that is not part of them in the guise of socialism. However, in either case, quote, they failed because their conception of what was a different form from bourgeoisie thought and different from doctrinaire socialist thought inevitably turned out to be merely another branch of bourgeoisie thought. Kwame Nkrumah told us that it was because the people wanted socialism that the phrase African socialism became a necessity in the platform distinction. Oh, diction. Yeah, not distinction, diction. In the political writings of African activists, intellectuals, and heads of parties and states. However, the phrase lost legitimacy as it became identified with policies that didn't promote genuine socialist economic and social development. Kwame Nkrumah. We're going to talk about hold on. I had to take a drink. Who's in here? How's everybody doing? Hope everybody's okay. All right.
I'm doing good.
Anything before I move on to Kwame Nkrumah?
I think that the analysis that I think the analysis of the fact that there is a critique from oppressed people of not being able to be a part of the oppressor group applies to more than just than the group being talked about now. I think it applies to every marginalized group.
Yeah, but this book's specifically talking about the black radical tradition, but I do agree with you. But this one's more to the point of black radical tradition.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just saying that it applies to more than that area.
Mm-hmm. All right. Kwame Nkrumah. We should be quick to note that Fanon urged us to stretch Marxist analysis, not abandon the methodology of revolutionary socialism. When we stretch something, we must maintain or even tighten our grip on it. In this case, we must recall that revolutionary socialist philosophy, theory, and methodology don't require us to fixate on prior conclusions, nor to turn any prior conclusions into dogma. Rather, we are to use them as tools in the analysis of concrete situations and use the conclusions that are thus dawn as guides to action. When Weinrich says, quote, stretch, she really means abandon. Her aim is to dissuade colonized peoples from adopting and adapting socialist methodology. Weinrich seems to doubt and seems to want us to doubt the applicability of Marxist analysis to the struggle of non-European peoples. Here, her reasoning is a variant of a dominant objection to the study and use of scientific socialist methodology made in the 60s and the 70s in the US, particularly among New Africans, i.e., that Karl Marx was a white boy, quote unquote, and a racist, and thus unworthy of study by people of color. Among the most appropriate responses to such claims was that given by Huey P. Newton of the Black Panther Party. If you are a dialectical materialist, Marx's racism does not matter. You do not believe in the conclusion of one person, but in the validity of the mode of thought. And we have a party, as dialectical materialists, recognize Karl Marx as one of the great contributors to that mode of thought. Whether or not Marx was a racist is irrelevant and immaterial to whether or not the system of thinking he helped develop delivers truth about processes in the material world. Again, separating someone from the actual tool of methodology of Marxism. Walter Rodney suggests that the question of the relevance of revolutionary socialist thought to the struggle of African peoples is most often raised by those who operate from within the bourgeoisie framework. Quote, one starts out located within the dominant mode of reasoning, which is the mode of reasoning that supports capitalism and which questions the logic and relevance of socialism and even opposes its study. End quote. Ronnie holds that revolutionary socialism is valid for peoples in this period, not only in Europe, but also in Africa and the Caribbean and the US, because it retains its potential as a tool and sets up conceptions that operate across time and space. Real quick, I think we're gonna see what he has to say here quick. A methodology which begins its analysis of any society, of any situation, by seeking the relations which arise in production between people. There are whole varieties of things which flow from that people's consciousness. It formed in the interventions. You have the interventions in nature. Nature itself is humanized through its interaction with people labor, and people's labor produces a constant stream of technology, which in turn creates other social changes. So this is the crux of the scientific socialist perception, a methodology that addresses itself to people, relationship in the process of production, and on the assumption, which I think is a valid assumption, that production is not merely the basis of people's existence, but the basis for defining people as a special kind of being with a certain consciousness, which is a very powerful force, and one that even some Marxists have been attempting to underestimate. Rodney Also says that the methodology and the ideology of socialism have been utilized, internalized, domesticated in large parts of the world that are not European, and that revolutionary socialism is already the ideology which was used by Cabral, which was used by Cyril Machel, Machel, in which it is used on the African continent itself, and underline and underscore struggle and the construction of a new society. Weinreich suggests that the Marxian / scientific socialist categories and concepts that need stretch are: 1. Class structures, because race and not class is a key category in the colonial situation, or as she puts it, economic relations are secondary to racial ones. To support this claim, she quotes Fanon, but appears to take the quote out of context, while also distorting it by omission. Economic reality, inequality, and the immense differences of ways of life never come to mask the human realities. When we examine at close quarters the colonial context, it is evident that what parcels out of the world is, to begin with, the fact of belonging to or not belonging to a given race. There's a fundamental distinction between European class structure and colonial race structure. To support this claim, she quotes that Fanon, but again, I think somewhat out of context and distorts it by omission. The governing race is first and foremost those who come from elsewhere, those who are unlike the original inhabitants. The others were to believe first in the existence of race structure that negates or subordinates the existence of relevance of class structure and economic relationship. And why? Because the colonialists are those from everywhere else. This geographical differences, as she called it, actually marks the distinction between two nation classes and race, is used to mask the economic material base. There is no race structure, only racialized national class structure unique to colonial and capitalist relations. When Fanon talks about the colonial bourgeoisie as, quote, a true branch of the bourgeoisie of the mother country that derives its legitimacy and its forces and its stability from the bourgeoisie of the homeland, I get no sense in his seeing this class structure in racial terms. The other are the representatives of a class, a nation, not a race. We are a species in a socio-economic framework, not the biological one. Even when the context of is taken out of account, the point goes to the nature of the contradiction, the key category in colonial situation. An analysis of colonialism doesn't begin with a binary opposite, black and white race, but with economic, political, and social analysis of a class/national opponents. The point of contention between colonizers and colonized are sovereignty and economics, not race. Colonialism grafts a weakly imitative class structures into a colony, but it is always an alien system and one that affects urban areas only, leaving the rural areas and the peasantry outside the class structure. Thus, it's the classless masses, a twist of Fanon's use of the classless idlers in reference to lumpen elements that make the decolonization struggle. We can't ignore, as Weinreich seems to do, the fact that the people subjected to colonial oppression had their own classes and class structure prior to colonial contact. And these continue to exist even if not allowed independent operations and development. Wretched is full of examples and references to counter Weinreich's implications that the only class structure in colonized countries is that imported and grafted into them by colonialism. It may be that the proper way to interpret interpret Fanon's remarks about the peasantry being outside of the class system is the very interpretation that he seems to make when discussing the difference between the people in the towns and those in the rural areas, and the old new town and country contradiction. That is, it may be that being outside the class system actually means being excluded from the advantages of colonialism. If truth to be told, this is the only reading that makes sense, because Fanon is clearly aware of the class structure native to the colonized country, i.g., colonialism is often strengthened or established its domination by organizing a petrification of a country's district ringed around the marabouts, witch doctors, and customary chieftains. The majority of the country dwellers are still living in a feudal manner, and the full power of this medieval structure of society is maintained by the settlers, military and administrative officials. The native peasantry lives against a background of traditions where the traditional structures of society has remained intact. The historical materialism, or the materialist conception of history, because 1. The majority of the colonized people are not engaged in industrial production. Colonized people are engaged in resistance to colonialism and not class structure, which is said to prove that material forces aren't the base of history for colonized peoples. 3. The categories based and superstructure, because 1. On one hand, she claims Fanon didn't believe that the model or that these categories apply to the colonial situation. Yet she also claims that Fanon had adopted Althusser's, I can't say his name, division of the superstructure into repressive and ideological apparatus, and believed the former was operative in the colonial situation. It appears that Weinreich's idea of stretching these concepts and categories is to simply replace them with race, or to claim that Fanon replaced them with race. If we believe her, and not only is there a fundamental discontinuity in the thought of Marx and Fanon, but there's also new basis for the applicability of revolutionary socialism to the struggle of colonized people. I think her claim requires a bit more attention. With regards to her claim on class structure, let us start with the statement of hers that I used to open this section. And here's her statement. In general, Fanon agrees with Marx that history runs dialectically through the struggle of factions against factions, whereas Marx categorizes factions in terms of economic class. Fanon claims that race is a key categorical term for colonial situations. I don't think Weinreich has studied socialism, nor done extensive or critical reading of the works of Marx. If she had, I doubt she'd use the phrase economic class, because it is a sure giveaway of a superficial, economistic, and bourgeoisie orientation. Marx didn't perceive class formation and functions in purely economic terms. Weinreich phrases is the kind that Fanon would find dangerous and misleading. Contrary to popular belief, Marx didn't write on the subject of class in a definitive or detailed manner, in which we too often believe that he did. It's said that he was about to define class in a third volume of Capital, but the work breaks off before he could do so. However, we find a useful example of Marx's concept of class in the 18th premiere of Louis Bonaparte, where he holds, and this is him, insofar as millions of families live under economic conditions of existence that separate their mode of life, their interests, and their culture from those of other classes, and put them in hostile opposition to the latter, they form a class. Insofar as there is merely a local interconnection among these small holding peasants, and the identity of their interests begets no community, no national bond, and no political organization among them. They do not form a class. Clearly, Marx didn't see class in purely economic terms. And it isn't the mere objective economic similarities of interests that make class formation and function. While economic conditions are surely a part of the criteria of class formation, Marx gives us another indispensable criteria, which could be listed as 1. The class members must share a common position in the relations to the means of production, i.e., common economic conditions relative to their labor and the appropriation of the social surplus. 2. That they must share a separate way of life and culture existence. 3. That they must share a set of interests which are antagonistic to other classes. 4. That they must share a set of social relations, i.e., a sense of unity which extends beyond local boundaries and constitutes a national bond. 5. That they must share a corresponding collective consciousness of themselves as a class. And 6. They must create their own political organization and pursue their interests as a class. Present in this passage from the 18th Brumaire is a distinction between a class in itself and a class for itself, which Marx also made in The Holy Family. He used the term in itself, not to capture a contingent character of what group, which merely met the first of the criteria listed above. That is, the group which only shared an objective common relations in the means of production wasn't a real or complete or revolutionary class. It wasn't the gravedigger of capitalism that we tend to equate with the term working class or proletarian. The transformation of a group into a class for itself depends upon the acquisition of the development of the remaining elements, i.e., the group must develop consciousness of itself as a class, creating political organizations engaged in unified actions to oppose and defeat its class enemies, begins to build a society free from all forms of exploitation and oppression, and eliminate all class divisions. Hence why the proletariat is supposed to abolish itself as a class, becoming classless. Hi, Rufus. Weinreich says that Fanon and Marx agreed that history develops through the struggle of factions against faction, and that Marx calls these factions classes, and allegedly Fanon calls them races. It seems to me that Weinreich doesn't even want to use terms like class or class struggle, unless she can do so in a disparaging manner. I mean, why else avoid saying that Fanon and Marx agreed about the role of class struggle in the history of class society? However, what questions come in mind after reading her statement? The first question for me was, is this an accurate representation of Fanon's thought? Next, I asked whether she was sitting before us questioning on the constitution of history and or its motive forces. Is Weinreich saying that the motive forces underlining race and racial struggles are somehow different from those that apparently underline class and class struggle? Is she saying that for Fanon, the motive force of history for colonized people is race struggle and not class struggle? What truly underlines the seeming position between race and class? Or we can even ask again, what is the relations between race and class? That is, what is there other than that the concept of race prevents us from seeing what it makes the economic relations between groups of people that we'd otherwise categorize as classless nations or nationalities. On the other hand, the narrow concept of class prevents us from seeing that groups of people that have been racialized are, in fact, classless, most often circumscribed by national boundaries, and in this era of racialized capitalist, imperialist, and colonial exploitation. I'm going to address the question I raised and try not to lose my focus on the statement that the theme of stretching the concept of class struggle. But I have to link these tasks with two related statements, although the first will be dealt with on its own below. The first is Weinreich's remark that for Marx, history concerns the material relationships of people to the means of production. This is significant for here because her aim is, again, to show a divergence between the thought of Marx and Fanon on this question. Second, Weinreich asserts that, quote, for Marx, all history is the history of class struggle, while, quote, while for Fanon, the history of colonized people is the history of resistance to colonial invasion and domination. Marx therefore totalized history, and in so doing removes from consideration entire historical narrative. Fanon realized that Marx repeats Hegel's error of confusing Europe of the world. For the world, history is written by the Westerners to serve their purpose, so non-Westerners must make their own history. Now Weinreich advances a difference between the history of class struggle and the history of resistance, the history written by Westerners and the history made by non-Westerners. She also commits an injustice to her readers by repeating the charge long ago made and laid to rest that Marx, and by implication, socialist methodology, is irrelevant to non-Western people because he totalized history and leaves out of it, or without it, the non-Western world. Amilcar Cabral. Hey, pizza. Good to see you. Hope you're doing well. To help me tie all this together, this is Amilcar Cabral. To help me tie all this together, I have to bring Amilcar Cabral into the mix with his, quote, The Weapon of Theory. This piece was, in the 1970s and 80s, often cited by petty bourgeois intellectuals and bourgeois nationalists as an example of Cabral's alleged divergence from Marx on the question of class struggle as the motive force of history. In fact, Cabral did stretch doctrinaire Marxism in that he made even more explicit that what had already been asserted by Marx, the weapon of theory, quote unquote, was delivered by Cabral at the first, Tricontinental Conference of the Peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, held in Cuba in 1966. He proposed his purpose was to present an opinion of the foundations and objective of national liberation and the relations of social structures. The relevant points and parts of the speech are as follows. Here we go. I love this shit. Yes, I love Fanon. I love this. This is amazing. New African movement. I love the New African movement. Those who affirm, in our case correctly, that the motive force of history is class struggle would certainly agree to the revision of his affirmation to make it more precise and to give it an even wider field of application if they had a better knowledge of the essential characteristics of certain colonized people, that is to say, peoples dominated by imperialism. In fact, in the general evolutions of humanity and of each of the peoples of which it is composed, classes appear neither as a generalized or a simultaneous phenomenon throughout the totality of these groups, nor as a finished, perfect, uniformed, and spontaneous whole. The definition of classes within one or several human groups is a fundamental consequence of the progressive development of the productive forces and the characteristics of the distinctions of the wealth produced by the group or usurped from others. That is to say that the socioeconomic phenomenon class is created and developed as a function of at least two essential and interdependent variables: the level of productive forces and the pattern of ownership of the means of production. This development takes place slowly, gradually, and unevenly by quantitative and generally imperceptible variations of the fundamental components. Once a certain degree of accumulation is reached, this process then leads to a qualitative jump characterized by the appearance of classes and of conflict between them. Let me see here. Your followers. Oh. Cabral then poses the question: does history begin with the development of classes and class struggle? To reply in the affirmative would be to place outside of history the whole period of life of human groups, from their discovery of hunting and later of nomadic and sedentary agriculture to the organization of herds and a private appropriation of land. It would also be to consider that this we refuse to accept that various human groups in Africa, Asia, and Latin America were living without history or outside history at the time when they were subjected to the yoke of imperialism. So they were brought into history by the white people. Good job, white people. Class struggle is the motive force of history only in specific historical periods, i.e., after the development of classes within one of several human groups. Thus, this means that before the class struggle, and necessarily after it, one of several factors was and will be the motive force of history. It is not difficult to see that this factor in the history of each human group is a mode of production, the level of productive forces, and the pattern of ownership characteristic of that group. Furthermore, as we have seen, classes themselves, class struggle, and their subsequent definitions are the result of development of the productive forces in conjunction with the pattern of ownership of the means of production. And it might, like the proletariat grows with the bourgeoisie because the bourgeoisie needs people to produce their profits for them. Hence, why we grow with them as they expand markets. So the productive forces in the proletarian class then builds up more. If therefore it seems correct to conclude that the level of productive forces, the essential determining element in the content of form of class struggle, is the true and permanent motive force of history. Cabral concluded therefore that history exists before rise of classes and class struggle, and that each human group makes history and will continue to do so because history has continuity even after the disappearance of the class struggle or of class themselves. People will outlive classes and will continue to produce and make history, since we can never be free of the burdens of our needs of mind and of the body, which are the basis of development of the forces of production. I must pause here to say, 1, the question here involves class struggle bounded by capitalism. There was class struggle prior to the rise of capitalist states. 2, the question here involves the relations between nations either dominated by capitalist relations, and on the other hand, nations dominated by imperialism/colonialist relations. There are nations on the planet prior to the rise in Europe under the capitalist impulse. I want to continue in other key points made by Cabral in the Weapon of Theory, because they'll help us to see the complete picture and the steps taken, as well as help us to exercise greater facility in the use of the tools. 1, prior to the private appropriation of the means of production in the communal era, there were no classes and no state. 2, as a productive force developed, so did private appropriation of the means, the development of conflict and of interest within the society, and the appearance of classes in feudal or assimilated agriculture or agro-industrial societies. And then there was a appearance of state structure, class structure, being the social expression of the contradictions in the economic field between the mode of production and the private appropriation of the means of production. So he's talking about the division of labor. The division of labor. After the communal sense, there was a division of labor as the slave society in general, not with Africa, because Africa wasn't able to go through, well, some of them went through a feudal state. They did, but not to the degree like Western Europe. So they did, but it wasn't. It was still a different type of phenomenon, different type of condition. 3, imperialism makes its appearance as, quote, a worldwide expression of the search for profit and the ever increasing accumulation of surplus value by monopoly financial capital, proprietary transplanted from the sea to dry land, proprietary reorganized, consolidated, and adapted to the aims of exploiting the natural and human resources of our peoples. Real quick, just making sure. 4, the essential characteristics of imperialist domination is the negation of the historical process of the dominated people by means of violent usurpation of the freedom of development of the national productive forces. National liberation is the process and result of people's rejection of the negation of their historical process, regaining their historical personality, and returning to history through the destruction of imperialist domination, i.e., to free the process of development of the national productive forces. However, 6, the principal aspect of national liberation struggle is the struggle against neocolonialism, i.e., the struggle against the native agents of imperialism and the would-be new ruling class of the liberated nation. Thus, genuine national liberation necessarily corresponds to a revolution within the dominant or newly dependent society. 7, there are only 2 paths for an independent nation to return to imperialist domination, neocolonialism, capitalism, state capitalism, or to take the way of socialism. 8, that a genuine national liberation is evident by changes in the relations of production, ownership of the means, which free the development of productive forces, people. The increase, when they mean productive forces, they mean people, yes. The increase in the development of the productive forces allows the elimination of private appropriation of the means and eventually the eventual elimination of classes, class struggle, and the state. New and hitherto unknown forces in a historical process are unleashed. The social structures returns to horizontality at the high level, and productive forces, social relations, and the appreciation of human values. Real quick before I move on, anybody have any questions before I move?
No.
Any questions? No? Okay. Joe, any questions? I'm guessing since they didn't unmute. Okay, no, I'm good. Okay, good. One of the keys is to remember that. Oh, they want me to do a puzzle. Hold on, everybody. One of the keys to remember that at the center of the concept of productive forces and at the center of the concept of people, combine this with the understanding that history was and is made by people producing to satisfy their needs of body and of mind. I think we should note that Cabral makes no reference to race or racial groups, but instead talks about human groups. Note, too, that the piece of that the piece is about class and class struggle, drawn from the particular experience of the people of Guinea-Bissau, but with the applicability of all other colonized and exploitative social settings. Finally, note that he opens the topic by affirming that, in our case, the motive force of history is now the class struggle. Is Cabral revising Marx, or is he revising certain elements of so-called Marxism and claims made by imperialism, e.g., the colonized people had no history? Did Marx actually hold that history began with class and class struggle? Why were questions about history and class struggle with reference to Africa and other colonized people even raised? To believe Reinwich, we have to believe that colonized people have no productive forces and no mode of production prior to European contact, that their society somehow developed outside of the material world, and the social and productive relations that rise from their historical activities. They had to believe that the concept and categories of socialist methodology didn't apply to non-Western peoples because of some biological factors. We'd have to believe that Africans and other non-European peoples somehow avoided the development of classes and states through essentially the same means of process that led to the development of classes and state in Europe. Classes are consequences of historical development, and we can't claim that Africans have made history and then try to deny that they had classes and states before contact with Europeans. Deny that classes arose among African people as a natural consequence of their struggle to produce, and gradual and unequal appropriation of social wealth by groups within the societies which came to be called classes. Africans had and made history because they had modes of production, because they had developed their productive forces, and the level of productive forces is the true and permanent motive of force history. Does race factor into the character of level of productive forces? Does race supersede or replace productive forces as the motive forces of history? Does race take priority over satisfaction of our needs of body and mind to become the basis of the development of history and productive forces? Maybe we can begin to tie all these together by going back to some of the questions that I raise above. Bullet 1. What constitutes history and its motive forces? History is the activity of people engaged in production to satisfy their material and spiritual needs. The motive forces of history is the level of development of the productive forces, people. Bullet 2. What motive force underlines class struggle? The contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production, i.e., the pattern of ownership of the means of production. The people struggle to replace the existing relations of production, to change the existing patterns of ownership of the means and the appropriation of surplus value, in order to allow the productive forces to freely develop and establish a new set of property relations. Bullet 3. What motive forces underline the so-called race struggle? Actually, the same motive force that underlines class struggle, only race disguises the material economic relations and the essential struggle to free and develop the productive forces. Imperialism and colonialism and racialized capitalism or forms of domestic colonialism has transformed classic class relations within single societies into national class relations between people. What is distinction between race and class? Both are social structures, social constructions, but class helps to locate and understand the source of social contradictions and the basis of social development. Race, on the other, source of social contradictions and obstructs the progressive development of human species, i.e., the productive forces of humanity as a whole. What is the relations between race and class? In this context, it's the material base. Again, race serves the base with the race serves serves the base in this instance by hiding it, while class analysis reveals it. Race obscures class. What is the historical resistance? The answer can be found. That is, Weinrichs opposes it not only to a history of class struggle, but to the very notion that colonized peoples have a material relations to the means of production. In this context, the phrase history of resistance is a petty bourgeois camouflage of class/struggle to free the national productive forces and to develop the socialist revolutionary process. The image that the petty bourgeois forces present before the people is that claiming the ideal of a grand unity cemented by skin color or superficial understanding of culture. The petty bourgeoisie forces want to govern and to acquire wealth. They do not want opposition to these aims to come in the form of an enlightened and self-motivated people who move forward, screaming, "Stop thief!" and all power to the people. All right, we're good. We're still good. Now, was Cabral revising or diverging, right? No one's there? Anybody there? No one's there. I guess I'll look it up.
Sorry, for some reason my fingers wouldn't touch the freaking mic. Yes, it's diverging.
Yes, thank you both. Thank you. For Marx, scientific socialism, when he refined the relations of class struggle to history, not necessary. This is, although Cabral's formulation seemed original to some, Lenin, for example, had earlier stated that just as material causes underline all natural phenomenon, so the development of human society is conditioned by the development of the material forces and productive forces. However, Marx often quoted remarks on the material base of society also go to the point to define history and of the productive forces being the true and permanent motive force of history. That is, from the beginning of human social living, people must first produce, and from this everything else arises. History does nothing to possesses. History does nothing. It possesses no immense wealth. It wages no battles. It is man, people, real living men, people, that does all that possesses and fights. History is not a person apart, using man, people, as a means for its own particular aims. History is nothing but the activity of man, people, pursuing their aims. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels held that the underlying basis of social development history was the process of productive forces and productive relations. The first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. The first historical act of these individuals, distinguishing them from animals, is not that they think, but that they begin to produce their means of subsistence. Quick. Hold on. Sorry, everybody. Okay. Why did Cabral have the need to stretch Marxism on this question? First, because he believed with Lenin, quote, we do not regard Marx theory as something complete and unavoidable. On the contrary, we are conceived that it had only laid the foundation stone of the science which socialists must develop in all directions if they wish to keep pace with life. My emphasis. Cabral directed his words to the petty and pseudo-bourgeois nationalists, as well as the vulgar Marxists and the colonialists. Did Marx hold that history began with the appearance of classes and class struggle? We've seen that he did not. This being so, how then did the issue arise? In the Communist Manifesto, one reads in the opening lines the broader claim that, quote, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. It's this statement that serves all those who want to claim that Marxism totalizes history, etc. It didn't seem to help that in the later edition of the Manifesto, Engels tries to clarify the line by saying that is all written history. In 1847, the prehistory of society, the social organization existed previous to recorded history, as was all but unknown. This is still Eurocentric, but note that it not only leaves out of history non-Europeans, but many European peoples as well. Rather Eurocentric or merely an oversight, other language helps to slightly clarify the errors, i.e., the whole history of mankind since the dissolution of primitive tribal societies holding land and in common ownership, as being a history of class struggle contests between exploiting and exploited, ruling and oppressed classes, on the issue of the stretching of historical materialism, or more properly, the materialist conception of history. Weinreich attempts to show the divergence between Marx and Fanon by first claiming that history, for Marx, concerned the material relationship of peoples up to the means of production, and limits its application to the 19th century European industrial capitalism. She then quotes Fanon as if he directly opposes Marx's premise from the quote, the relation of man with matter, with the world outside, and with the history are, in the colonial period, simply relations with food and, by the extension, with the ground on which it grows. I think we should immediately go to our copy of Wretched and examine the context with which Fanon's words were used. They're going to start where he discussing the poverty of absurdity of theories of colonialist scientists and the important theoretical and practical question that these theories arise from the decolonization process. It appears that the specific question under discussion is the inherent criminality of colonized people that is claimed by colonialism. Fanon wants to break up this idea to further deploy revolutionary and social consciousness by giving the explanation of criminality of colonized people during the colonial period, i.e., before the war starts and before the people begin transformation of their social being. Now, Fanon tells us that since the beginning of the war, everything was changed. But from what to what? The remainder of tell us the nature of things after the beginning of the war, while tells us the nature of things before the beginning of the war. Under the colonial regime, anything may be done for a loaf of bread or a miserable sheep. The relations of man with matter, with the world outside, and with history are in the colonial period simply relations with food. For the colonized person, living doesn't not mean embodying moral values or taking one's place in a coherent and fruitful development of the world. Ordinarily, I'd say that we've seen enough to put the cover off of Weinreich's true aim, and to show that, at least with her chosen example, Fanon does not reject the fundamental proposition of the materialist conception of history. However, some people may question whether the relations with food and the ground on which it grows in an underdeveloped setting may fundamentally differ from material relations of people of the means of production in the industrial settings. We've already addressed this question in essence as we went through Marx's idea of history as the activity of people in pursuit of their aims via the production of their means of subsistence. An alternate phrasing of the fundamental proposition of the materialist conception of history. We've also addressed the question, in essence, as we covered Cabral's stretching on the question of the true and permanent motive forces of history or social development. However, a slightly more direct approach requires that we focus on the content and the meaning of means of production and what constitutes a material relationship to them. That is, must there be an industrial or even a capitalist economic setting before people can have a material relations to the means of production? Does the relations of food and ground/land on which it grows contradicts or differ from the material relations of the means of production? By the means of production, is it meant the sum of the material elements of the productive forces, i.e. the objects of labor upon which people work, and the implements of labor, the sum of tools, sortages, and facilities, and land? Hold on a second, let's see how. All right, we're getting there. I got enough time. Okay. A material relations is, of course, let me make sure. Yeah. Material relations is, of course, a physical one, but it also a social relations, reflecting the connection between the means of production of the part of both those who own or who have privately appropriated the social means of production and those who have been deprived of ownership and are exploited. In other words, both those who are exploited and the exploiters have a material relations to the means of production. I wonder if Fanon shared a similar understanding when, for example, he described independence of the conditions for truly liberated people, i.e. people who are truly masters of all the material means, which make possible the radical transformation of society. Next, as Warwick claims to show us how and why historical materialism needs to be stretched, she claims that colonized peoples aren't alienated from work because they have no mass participation in the industrial economy, as if only through the exploitation of industrial labor does colonialism exercise its exploitation and dehumanization of colonized lands and peoples. Weinreich's petty bourgeois interpretation of Marxism causes her to define alienation merely as a separation and estrangement of a worker for her or his work. We understand alienation as a concept described both the process and the result of converting the practical and theoretical products of human activity and human properties and capabilities into something independent of people and dominated over them. The transformation of some phenomena in the relations into something different from what they are in themselves. The distortion of people's minds and their actual relations of life. Alienation is a perversion, not only to our relations to physical labor, narrowly defined, but also our relations to other people, to social institutions, and to nature, and our own sense of being human. Capitalism and its expression through imperialism and colonialism is inherently alienating. What is colonialism if not alienating, dehumanizing? What is wretched if not an examination of the alienation of colonized people and the efforts of disalienate represented by the decolonization process? The loss of independence and control over their lives and the resources of their land alienates the colonized people. The decolonization process is the means used to regain or reconstitute the humanity of colonized people, i.e. to reestablish their independence and sovereignty, their natural relations to each other and to nature. Throughout Wretched, Fanon focused upon the need for development of people's consciousness so that they can develop an understanding and the cause sources of their alienation, to define their oppression as alienation, and to realize that just as just as it's caused by people, the material relations of production. It can be changed, eliminated by the people themselves and their creations of new material relations of production, ownership relations of to means. Moreover, the revolutionary consciousness that Fanon urges is one that understands that all the colonized people are alienated, not just those engaged in industrial production or those occupying elitist positions. Thus, all of the people are obliged to develop revolutionary consciousness, become human again, and to reconnect their social reality, being on the basis of material relationship, becoming in the process of collective masters of their society. We now arrive at Weinreich's description of why and how how our thinking on base and superstructure should be stretched, or rather, her claims regarding Fanon's alleged position on the matter. However, we may become a bit confused because Weinreich, one, rests her argument on the superficial, misleading definition of the categories, and two, she doesn't seem to know which of three pivots to make her stand on. She begins with, here we go. Central to Marx's thought is the model of base and material means of production, distribution and exchange, the superstructure and cultural world of ideas as an art, religion, and laws, which are determined by, not independent of, the base. In a capitalist society, the base depends on the equal, dangerously unstable relationships between workers, the proletariat, and the bosses, those who control capital. Therefore, the job of the superstructure is to make the inequities of these base seem natural and good. Based on this definition, we probably need to discuss 1, her narrow definition of base, 2, her narrow definition of superstructure, 3, her implication that the superstructure has no independence, 4, her attempt to restrict the application or relevance of the categories of capitalist Western social society settings, which can coincide with her use of the term model. The base and superstructure are categories that characterize the basic structure elements of all social formations and express the relations of being to thinking in the social realm. By underlining all ideas, the institutions in societies, the base is the basis of all social life, i.e. not restricted to Weinreich's ideal of material. The superstructure designates more than a narrowly conceived cultural world and ideas. It also designates institutions and organizations, the major of being the state, despite Weinreich's assertion to the contrary. The superstructure does maintain a relative independence from the base, and it not only serves the base, but influences it. Finally, the elements of the superstructure are products of weapons of class struggle. Weinreich presents the first of her pivots as follows. Fanon's ideas about base and superstructure resemble those of French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, who refines the model in terms of power. For Althusser, ideological state apparatus are elements of the superstructure, political parties, educational institutions, and media literature that sells us the status quo. In the process, they mask and mystify representative state apparatus, the police, law courts, the military, that impose the status quo by force. Fanon finds a similar distinction useful in analyzing the colonial situation. So on the one hand, Fanon's idea on base and superstructure resembles those Marx's ideas of auxiliaries. I can't say it. I.e. believes the representative apparatus of the superstructure is operative in colonial situations. We go on to her second pivot. This is her second pivot. Fanon doubts that Marx's base superstructure model applies to masses in the colonized country. He agrees that the capitalist society, the superstructure, generates an expression of respect for the established order that serves to create around the exploited person an atmosphere of submission and inhibition which lightens the task of policing considerably. In the colonies, however, ideological state apparatus are eclipsed by representative state apparatus. Agents of government speaks the language of pure force. They do not lighten the oppression nor seek to hide the domination, but maintain the status quo directly by means of rifle butts and napalm. Wretched. To Fanon, colonial rule operates not through managing consent, but through inflicting terror and despair. If we take a look at paragraph of Wretched, where Fanon draws the distinction between the role of the repressive state apparatus in the capitalist and colonized countries, even without our own critique of this paragraph in its context, we ask, does it go to show, one, an absence of base and superstructure in colonized countries? Two, Fanon's alleged divergence from Marx on the nature of the base and superstructure. And three, what the model doesn't apply to colonized countries. All question marks. We have 2 more pages and we'll be done. So, as I read it, rather the ideological or the repressive apparatus are dominant in colonial countries. They are both elements of the superstructure. Maybe I'm just missing Weinreich's point. However, as if she's not confident in the strength of these first 2 pivots, Weinreich includes with the third. Here's a third pivot. In fact, Fanon believes that colonialism causes the Marxist model of base and superstructure to collapse altogether because economic relations are secondary to racial ones. That is, the Manichaean thinking on which colonialism depends blots out or distinctions, hierarchies, and logical patterns. There is the superstructure in colonized countries, of course, but it operates upon the colonizers convincing them that they're promoting universal wonderful values of civilization, enlightenment, redemption. It also operates upon the small percentage of the native population that's being assimilated into a colonial system in order to promote the genuine eradication of the superstructure built by the bourgeois colonial environment. I must point out here that the quote of Fanon distorts by omission, and I will return to it below. Fanon turns his attention to the native intellectual and the problems of national culture. Where does Fanon say the economic relations are secondary to racial ones? No, I don't think so. No, I still don't think so. Where does Fanon say that he believes that no base and superstructure exists in colonized countries, other than the development by colonialism? The existence of Manichaean thinking doesn't make economic relations secondary or racial ones. It doesn't exactly what it's supposed to do. It masks and mystifies the economic relations and blots out the other distinctions, hierarchies, and logical patterns. What it does, it doesn't underline their primacy. The Manichaean thinking performs its role as the superstructural element by making race appear as external to the dominant over the economic. I hope I didn't miss it, did I? The economic motive relations. The economic motive of colonial relations. Sorry, let me see if I missed the star somewhere. Did I miss it somewhere? No, it's down there. Okay, never mind. You'd think that anyone with a PhD would be able to understand this. But then, as Fred Hampton used to say, we got people running around with degrees coming out of the wazoo, but they can't chew bubblegum and walk across the street at the same time. That is, they can't properly connect the stuff in their head to the living reality around them. 2 other quick notes here. 1, colonized societies clearly have their own base and superstructure prior to colonial subjugation, and these structural elements continue to maintain some independence and continue to develop even under colonial domination. In fact, during the decolonization struggle, new superstructural elements developed in direct opposition to the dominant superstructure of colonialism. Two, the superstructures imposed by colonialism does affect the majority of the colonized people. And that's where we'll stop, because we'll go into the next section, which is Fanon on race, racism, class, and the struggles of socialism and meditation. I know. That's why I said I'm going to stop.
No,
I was letting everybody know what we're gonna. I was letting everybody know what we're gonna do next. I was stopping there.
No, we don't stop there. We stop after the star.
Oh yeah. I gotta do the star. The colonial world is a Manichaean world. It is not enough for the settlers to delimit physically. That is to say, with the help of the army and the police force, the place of the native, as if to show the totalitarian character of colonial exploitation. The settler paints the native as a sort of acquiescence of evil. Native society is not simply described as a society lacking in values. It is not enough for the colonialists to affirm that these values have disappeared from, or still better, never existed in the colonial world. The native is declared insensible to ethics. He represents not only the absence of values, but also the negation of values. He is, let us dare to admit, the enemy of values, and in this sense, he is the absolute evil. He is the corrosive element, destroying all that comes near him. He is the deforming element, disfiguring all that has to do with the beauty of morality. He is the depository of maleficent powers, the unconscious and irretrievable instruments of blind force. Monsieur Maire could thus state seriously in the French National Assembly that the Republic must not be prostituted by allowing the Algerian people to become part of it. All values, in fact, are irrevocable, poisoned, and diseased as soon as they are allowed in contact with the colonized race. The customs of the colonized people, their traditions, their myths, above all, their myths are the very sign of that poverty of spirit and of their constitutional depravity. And that's it. That is it. We'll stop here at 306 in my book. 306. And then we'll continue on. See, I'm going to look ahead just real quick. I don't think there's a lot to look ahead. Oh, yeah. Thoughts on the deconstruction. Okay, cool. Oh, we're almost done. Holy crap. Oh, there's part 4. Wait, there's part 4. Never mind. We have part 4. Okay, cool. All right. Let's start a conversation. Go ahead. Who would like to start?
I've had a really bad headache. I don't really have any notes tonight.
Okay. Doodley, would you like to say anything about what we just talked about? And I got my first visible restriction. Look at that. Dooley, you there? You got on mute if you're there.
They must be busy.
They must be busy. Yeah, so what I've learned is that there's still a superstructure. There's still an economic base. Even if racism is one of the key factors within that, it's still, the economic base is still valid. It develops and transforms itself as you go through the different developments. Colonialism brought the factor of this, because they said that racism is within the superstructure and impacts the base economically, making it for racial capitalism and stuff like that. And also I understand that once racism and that contradiction, then we can actually get to the meats and potatoes of then the class struggle. So anybody else? Doodley, you there yet? You back? I tried. Gotta unmute. So we have to ever be observant of the economic base and the superstructure and how they impact each other and how they develop each other. Go ahead.
Sorry. I'm having to babysit my my mom.
It's okay.
Okay, so yeah, while both the economic, as you were saying, as the economic and social aspects are both important, neither of them exclude the others. Like, they don't erase each other's existence. In fact, what needs to happen is an analysis of seeing them both as working together. And the analysis of basically just everything you said is basically what I have to say.
Yeah, they said that the racism shields the economic base, so that way we don't actually like work together and fight together. Because there was one point before they gave white people more whiteness and power and whiteness and racism and settlerism, where like they understood that this is bad. Let's all work together and like, yeah. So I agree. Anything else?
Yeah, I would say that I would say that all of the systems shield each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, if anybody else wants to come up, they're welcome to. I doubt anybody will come up, but it's fine. I understand. No big deal. If you have any questions, tell me what the questions are in the comments. If you have any questions. Other than that, I think we might close it out. Give it a couple seconds. Who's in here? I don't know who E-Truck is. Who's E-Truck? What's I-Truck? Sorry, not E. I-Truck. Who's that? I have no idea who that is. I don't know if they're a friend or foe. So. All right. Well, if no one else has anything else to say, I appreciate everybody coming up and everything. We're coming to a close. We're coming to part 3 here soon. And then soon we'll go into dying colonialism. And I'm thinking about picking up some CRL James and a little bit of E.W. Du Bois coming up soon. So I want to read the Black Jacob up because I think that's about the Haitian Revolution. So I'm interested in that. Learning more about that historical epic period. So, but anyways, I'll go ahead and close it out unless anybody has something to say before I close it. No? Okay. Thank you.
Just much love. Take care.